Hi, boys and girls. We're to a picture book today. Last week, we finished reading Paul Bunyan Swings His Axe. And I bet some of you have wondered what happens to Paul Bunyan when that's all said and done. Well, listen today as we learn more about some of the natural wonders that Paul Bunyan created in his tall tales. Now, it's all made up, all make believe, part of a tall tale. But pay attention to how this story is different than Paul Bunyan Swings His Axe. We're going to compare and contrast the Bunyans. Now, I suppose that you have heard about the mighty logger Paul Bunyan and his great blue ox named Babe. In the early days of our country, Paul and Babe cleared the land for the settlers so farms and cities could spring up. And you probably know that Paul was taller than a redwood tree, stronger than 50 grizzly bears, and smarter than a library full of books. But you may not know that Paul was married and had 2 fine children. One day, when Paul Bunyan was out clearing a road through the forests of Kentucky, a great pounding began to shake the earth. Looking around, Paul discovered an enormous hole in the side of a hill. The lumberjack pulled up an acre of dry cane and fashioned a torch to light his way. Paul climbed inside the hole and followed the sound underground for miles, until he came to a large cavern glistening with crystals. By the flickering light of his torch, he saw a gigantic woman banging a behemoth pickaxe against the wall. It was love at first sight. One day when Paul was out, well, I did that one already. There's the pages together. "I'm Carrie McIntyre," the gigantic woman said. "I was sitting on the hill when my lucky wishbone fell down the crack into the earth. I've been digging all day trying to find it." With a grin on his face as wide as the Missouri River, Paul reached into his shirt pocket. "I've got one too," he said, pulling out his lucky wishbone. "Marry me, Carrie, and we'll share mine." Carrie agreed, and their wedding invitations were mailed out right away. The invitations were so large, only one needed to be sent to each state. Everyone could read them for miles. The invitation said, "You are cordially invited to the Mammoth wedding of Paul Bunyan and Carrie McIntyre." The couple were married in the enormous crystal chamber that Carrie had carved. And after the ceremony, folks began to call it Mammoth Cave. The giantess had dug more than 200 miles, making it the longest cave in the world. So the name fit perfectly. You can find that cave in Kentucky. Paul and Carrie settled down on the farm in Maine, and soon there were 2 new Bunyans. While Pa Bunyan traveled with his logging crew, Ma Bunyan worked the farm and cared for their jumbo boy named Little Jean and their gigantic girl named Teeny. Now, those are kind of strange names. A gigantic boy named Little Jean and a gigantic girl named Teeny? Well, actually, it was a jumbo boy. That's something we call an oxymoron. It means something different than the original. They mean opposites. Jumbo and little, gigantic and teeny. Authors having a fun play on these words. Have you noticed how many different words there are for big, like gigantic, enormous, mammoth, behemoth, jumbo? Might be more as we listen. One morning when Pa Bunyan was home between jobs, Ma Bunyan cooked up a hearty breakfast of pancakes and syrup. Teeny was wrestling with her big purple puma named Slink and accidentally dumped a silo of syrup on her head. Teeny's hair was so sweet, bears crawled into it and burrowed deep into her curls. We'll need a forceful shower of water to get rid of those varmints, Ma Bunyan declared. A silo is that tube that sits next to a barn by a farm. So imagine a whole silo full of syrup on your head. Sticky. Pa Bunyan had an idea. He placed his daughter on Babe and he led them to the Niagara River in Canada. The gargantuan father scooped up a huge hole in the middle of the riverbed. As the great river roared down into the deep hole, Teeny cried out in delight, "Niagara Falls!" Teeny showered in the waterfall, and the pesky bears were washed downstream. You will find Niagara Falls on the border between Canada and New York State. While little Gene was 5, he wanted to work too. So he followed his pa out to his logging camp in Montana. Thinking his son was too young to do much of anything, Pa set little Gene down in the barren canyon in Utah to play for the day. When the lumberjack went to fetch him, he couldn't believe his eyes. Little Gene had carved the canyon into a wonderland of fanciful shapes. Paul Bunyan's got tongue-tied and said, "That's a mighty Bryce Canyon, coy. A mighty nice canyon, boy." Somehow, part of the mix-up stuck, and to this day, the canyon is known as Bryce Canyon. You will find that in Utah. After all the sculpting, little Jean's shoes were full of sand. Pa knew Ma Bunyan wouldn't want her clean floors dirtied up. So he told little Jean to sit down and empty out his shoes. The sand from little Jean's shoes blew away on the eastern wind and settled down a state away. It covered a valley 10 miles long, making sand dunes 800 feet high. Everyone knows how the great sand dunes of Colorado came to be. You'll find those in Colorado at Great Sand Dunes National Park. Great place to go. Very hot sand. One summer, little Jean and Teeny wanted to go to the beach. Ma Bunyan told them to follow a river to the ocean, but all the rivers flowed west back then, so they missed the Atlantic Ocean and ended up on the other side of the country instead. Ma Bunyan tracked them out to the Pacific Ocean, where she found Teeny riding on the backs of 2 blue whales and little Jean carving out 50 zigzag miles of the California coast. When Ma Bunyan saw what her son had done, she exclaimed, "What's the big idea, sir?" From that time on, the scenic area was known as Big Sur. You will find that on the coast of California. And those whales he's on, if you think about sticking that big blue whale in our 4th grade hallway, it would fill that hallway from side to side and all the way down. He was using them as skis. Ma Bunyan knew she had to put up a barrier to remind her children not to wander off too far. So on the way home, everyone pitched in and built the Rocky Mountains. Teeny gathered up and sorted out all the rivers, letting some flow east and others west. After that, the children had no trouble following the eastern rivers down to the Atlantic Ocean, where they wanted to go out exploring. Ma Bunyan would call out, "Now don't cross that continental divide, children." That's the Rocky Mountain Ridge out in the western part of our country. The best thing about camping is sleeping outdoors, and the worst thing is not having enough hot water. That's why the Bunyans always camped in Wyoming. By the time their camping years were over, Ma Bunyan had poked more than 300 holes in the ground with her pickaxe and released tons of hot water from geysers. But Ma got tired of poking so many holes, so she made a geyser that blew every hour on the hour. After that, there was a steady supply of hot water to keep the giants' clothes and dishes sparkling clean. Teeny named the geyser Old Faithful, And to this day, Old Faithful still blows its top every hour in Yellowstone National Park. You'll find that in Wyoming. As our great country grew up, so did the Bunyan children. When the kids left home, Ma and Pa Bunyan retired to a wilderness area where they still live happily. It's kind of a funny play on that national park. That's probably Arches National Park in Utah. Teeny hitched a ride on a whale over to England and became a famous fashion designer. Her colorful skirts made from air balloons and her breezy blouses cut from ship sails were a sensation at the World's Fair in London. Little Jean traveled to Venice, Italy, where he studied astronomy and art. Every day, the gondoliers would take their passengers down the Grand Canal to watch the giant artist chiseling his marble sculptures. Now, Venice in Italy is a city where the streets are actually canals or waterways, so you get around by a boat called a gondolier. After graduation, little Jean decided to explore new lands as his parents had done. So he took 2 great jumps and 1 flying leap and bounded up into outer space. In 1976, the year of our country's bicentennial or 200th birthday, a spacecraft sent by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was on a mission to study Mars. The spacecraft was named Viking 1, and it took many photographs of the surface of the planets. One mysterious photo looked like a face carved out of a colossal rock. Some say the photograph is not a face, but an illusion caused by lights and shadows on the rock. Others think the famous Martian face is just the spitting image of little Jean Bunyan. If that's so, who knows what he's up to on other planets? Only time will tell. And here we have a place of all the different places that the Bunyans were and mentioned in this story. We are right about here in central Wisconsin. So think about, how does Paul Bunyan swings his axe compare to the story of the Bunyans? Little different perspective there in your reading.